Okay then. So welcome everybody to today's talk with our lovely author, John Howell, and he's going to talk about his book. So John is a retired engineer and lives in eastern Melbourne with his lovely wife, Leah, which I can attest to. She is lovely. They have grown-up children and a brood of grandchildren. Retirement has given John and Leah time to travel, or did before COVID. This has included a 4-month drive from their home to Nilgaroo Reef and living for 3 months in a small hilltop village in Italy. A passion for scuba diving on shipwrecks led him to maritime history and then into military history, and an urge to discover and write. The Only Woman at Gallipoli is his first book. It emerged from a snippet that he had read, a scrap of a story so fascinating that it started a long search. The search became a voyage of discovery, from Australia libraries to Turkey and unseen diaries and love letters in London and Northern England. A story was unearthed over 5 years as he found and assembled the pieces to an amazing jigsaw puzzle. Without knowing it, until the end, that final picture would look so good. So welcome to John, and we'll go from there.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if everybody could mute themselves if they haven't already, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'll start by turning the story on its head a little bit and say that today I'm not going to talk about a woman, because it came to me as a mystery story that there were 2 women that it might have been that managed to visit Gallipoli during the campaign. So my obsession was spending years and years trying to work out just which of these women it was. So you'll hear about 2 women today. And I will say that what you will see and what you will hear and what I'll read about letters and things out of the book, I have made none of it up. It is all exactly as I've discovered it, and it hasn't been coloured, enhanced, or mythical conversations are not included. So let's start. Let's go on to the second picture. Thanks, Heidi. Aha, okay. Some history. The Gallipoli Peninsula, there it is, was invaded on April the 25th, 1915. Now, the ANZACs landed an hour or so before everyone else, and north of Gallipoli is a little bump of a headland called Ari Banu. One side of it is ANZAC Cove, the other side of it is North Beach. So on this map, which is the 1915 map, it says Ari Banu with a question mark, because the map maker didn't know where it was, wasn't allowed to know where it was, I'm not sure. So the Australians landed up there. The French landed on the other side of the Narrows, down where it says Dardanus on this map, and the British landed at an assortment of points around the tip of Cape Helles. Now, the plains on the other side where the French landed, they are the plains of ancient Troy. So history here does go back the odd 3,500 years, and the plan at one of the British beaches was a rerun of the Trojan horse. So can we have the next picture, please, Heidi? There we go. So the Trojan horse was an old steamer called the River Clyde. Those canvas flaps on the side are holes that were cut, and there were walkways, and they ran the old steamer aground, and 2,000 troops were going to rush ashore. They were going to overwhelm the Turkish defenders. It was a plan that was good on paper, and like many of those good plans on paper, was turned into a shemozzle the next day. So at the end of April the 25th, about half the men had managed to get off the ship, and most of them were dead or wounded in the water or on the little beach where this photograph was taken from. So the next day, April the 26th, an officer went ashore. Next picture, thanks, Heidi. He was Lieutenant Colonel Charles Hotham Montague Doughty Wiley. Surprisingly, everyone called him Dick. It was a lot simpler. So we'll just call him Dick for most of the thing. And in most of the letters I read that were written to or from a couple of women, then they called him Dick as well. He even signed his letters Dick. So there you go. It was a lot easier. I'll interrupt myself a little bit here. Some years ago, I was in Wales at an archive of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. They gave me a copy of this little miniature, and that's a full-size colour copy of the miniature, which, as you can see, was was painted from that photograph. When we said, "Oh, it's interesting to actually see that red of his dress uniform," they said, "Oh, did you want to see that?" And they went out the back into the archives and actually brought his uniform out and showed it to me. So it's interesting.
The speaker's not working.
No.
It was interesting to see that, if you get some helpful people in an archive one day and they think you're really interested, then they go out of their way to give you some good information. So anyway, April the 26th, Dick Dowley, he went ashore that on the second day from the River Clyde. He took command of these bedraggled survivors that had spent all night huddled on the beach, and he led them on a heroic charge, and he finally overwhelmed the Turkish defenders at V Beach. We have the next picture, please, Heidi. So there's no pictures of it, but there's an illustration. So there was the old ruined fort of Saddle Bar that had been blasted by the warships offshore, and then the little village behind. He led them on a charge. There he is in the middle. Now, as you can see, he is unarmed, and he's waving. He led the charge waving a little bamboo officer's swagger stick, like this one that I'm trying to hold in front of the camera here. Anyway, Dowley led the charge through the village, and there was a Major Muir watching from offshore. And he wrote in his diary, "The infantry pushed and tore through the village of Saddle Bar up to the fort, belching fire and death. The blood danced in our veins as we leaned and looked, our souls fighting with those men in the thick of the carnage. Their bayonets flashed in the dancing eastern sunlight." It was a pretty flowery description about the charge, and a lot simpler description about the end of the charge is written by another officer. He wrote, "The men lined the top edge of the moat, fired down on the retreating Turks. At this moment, Colonel Dowley, who had led his men to the last moment, was shot in the head, dying almost immediately on the summit of the hill he had so ably captured." So if there's such a thing as the male hero of my book, he really doesn't last very long. So Dick Dowley was hurriedly buried exactly where he fell, and a wooden cross was put up over the grave. Can we have the next picture, Heidi? So I don't know. So there's a very early picture of the grave. It's a wooden cross with a piece of plywood with his name written on it. You can almost see it says CHM Dowley. Still a war zone though. So no sooner does this happen than the sappers come along and they run the telephone wires across the top of the cross. Now I don't know who's been to Commonwealth War Grave cemeteries. They're all over the world, from from Springvale, in fact, to New Guinea and the Middle East and all over Europe. So they typically have, unfortunately, thousands of beautifully maintained graves. Well, Dick Dowley's grave has managed to survive on the Gallipoli Peninsula as a single grave. It is a war cemetery of one grave, and I don't know of any others. And another singular item, he was posthumously awarded the first Victoria Cross of the Gallipoli campaign. Now, Dick Dowley had been a hero before this, his last day. 6 years earlier, he was a diplomatic vice-consul in Turkey, of all places, and Muslim Turks started rioting, and they started killing Christian Armenians in a town called Adana. So on this day, Dick Dowley gathered up some Turkish troops, and he bluffed them into thinking that this British diplomat could take control of them, and he bluffed the rioters and the Armenians. It rode into the middle of this riot, fast turning into a massacre, and he saved the day. He stopped hundreds of people being killed. He ended up being shot in the arm and was awarded a medal by Turkey. Can we have the next picture, please, Heidi? So there were no pictures taken in the middle of the chaos, but he did make the front page of the graphic magazine. So this was also perhaps done from that photograph I showed you, because he's wearing that bright red dress uniform, and you can see he's got. Can we have the next picture, Heidi? It's the close-up there. You can see he's leading these Turkish troops, and he's been shot in the arm. He's got his arm in a sling. So 6 years after this, 6 years after being a hero in Turkey and being awarded a medal by Turkey, he's killed by them trying to invade their own country not that far away. So a crazy, crazy turnaround in that time. Back to Gallipoli. By November 1915, the campaign was 6 months old. Both sides had put up with a hot summer. They had plenty of dust, and they had plenty of flies, and that's about all that was in plentiful supply. And then if you think Melbourne's weather's changeable, then serious autumn storms started sweeping across the peninsula. Next picture, Heidi. So this is Suvla Bay, walking distance along the beach from ANZAC Cove. And this is the sort of ferocity of these storms that swept through the peninsula. The last ship sunk at Gallipoli was just offshore here, and it broke in half in this storm and sank. It had nothing to do with the warfare going on around it. So in the middle of this November chaos one day, a woman appeared at V Beach. She came up from that wreck of the River Clyde, went to Dick's single grave and put a wreath on that grave, and then promptly disappeared again. So she was the only woman at Gallipoli. If we can have the next picture. So here's the same grave 5 months after the first picture. So it's the same wooden cross and the same piece of plywood with his name on it. A little bit of concrete's been put over his body because he was only just below the rocks that were piled on the top. And mysteriously, this very well-made wreath has been put on the grave by this woman who appeared and then disappeared. By this stage, the French were looking after that part of the beach. So this is a French officer who's actually in the picture. I said at the start there were two women that I would talk about in the story. One of the two women who might have put that wreath on the cross was Dick's wife, Lillian. Can I have the next picture, thanks? She was born as Lillian Woolley, and as you see, she was a nurse. In 1899, she married an army doctor named Charles Adams, but unfortunately he died only about a year later. She was keen to hang on to her Woolley surname because when she married Charles Adams, they changed their name to become the Adams-Wooleys. And some years later, when she remarried to Dick Doughty, that's when they became the Doughty-Wooleys. Now, she'd inherited family money, and she'd used this money to start hospitals wherever she thought there was a need for them. And the first hospital she started with her first husband, so it's called the Adams-Woolley Hospital, and it's a big hospital still thriving in India today. Can we have the next picture, please? This is a later picture of Lillian when she's in fact Lillian Doughty Woolley, and now it's at a garden party in Turkey when Dick was there with his diplomatic role. So this is back in the days just before the uprising at Adana that we had in the story a little while ago. World War I started, and as I say, Lillian then set up a hospital, another hospital, this time for the French army. And she used her own money. She'd inherited family money, and she'd used her own money to set up hospitals where she thought there was a real need. So the next one was for French soldiers, and it was in France. She offered to set one up for the British, but they were silly enough to say, "I'm sorry, but you're only a woman." And that was about as far as the conversation she could get going with the British people. She kept diaries, and I've waded through hundreds of pages of them at the Imperial War Museum in London. So Dick was killed on the 26th of April, and she heard of her husband's death in a telegram only about a week later. And within another week, she was putting out feelers to be transferred to get out to be near Dick's single grave. And her first requests were through a Madame Carnot, who was part of the French hospital system, which was, where she was working at the time. So she wrote in her diary, "This afternoon an old gentleman arrived from Madame Carnot to try and put things right for us." So this is hospital talk. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done, but I asked him to speak to Madame Carnot about the Dardanelles." And soon she was asking anyone who might help her get out there. A later entry in her diary says, "Madame Carnot wrote today she could do nothing for the Dardanelles. I've written to the Ministry of War on the subject, and if they've nothing for me, I'll ask the Red Cross." Now, all this manoeuvring by Lillian wasn't because she wanted to get out there and put a wreath on the grave and disappear again. She felt if she could find her way there, she'd find a way to join her late husband. And she wrote about it in a letter to her mother. And she wrote to her mother, "I've applied for the Dardanelles. I feel if I'm allowed to go there, I shall not come back, but shall join Dick. It would be ever so much jollier for me to go on doing things with Dick in the next world than to drag along here by myself." Now, this letter was never going to calm Lillian's mother or family, and if the daughter mysteriously disappeared at Gallipoli, no one was going to be ever so much jollier. But that's the strange way that Lillian saw it. Lillian now started to listen to messages that she was getting from Dick, and she was getting them in her dreams at night. And she wrote in her diary on June the 7th, 1915, "I believe I had some sort of message from Dick last night. I was right. My permission for the Dardanelles has come. That is my permission from Dick. He said in his letter of April the 21st, and he didn't write too many after that, that when they were through with the landing, there might be something for me to do out there, and he would let me know. He did today. I received a message from Sir Ian Hamilton." General Sir Ian Hamilton was the man in overall charge of Gallipoli. "That Dick was buried, and that the burial was hurried, and that the grave should be seen to." Now, as far as Lillian's concerned, there's a big gap in the archives. Nothing solid exists about her from October 1915 until April 1916, about 6 months. And she then emerges, if you like, as the matron in charge of a British hospital on Lemnos. Now, the island of Lemnos is right near the Gallipoli Peninsula, almost within sight. And back in the centenary of Gallipoli, there were various TV shows about Australian doctors and nurses and the terrible conditions at Gallipoli, and they were based on the island of Lemnos. So in this November visit to the grave is right in the middle of this gap when somehow Lillian officially seems to just drop out of all the official records of anywhere. So if she perhaps found a way to visit what she called the other side and then come back, this might have been her opportunity to do that. Can we have the next picture, please? Here's a later picture of her between the wars, all dressed up. She's got the family jewels and all sorts of things on. She's also wearing a lot of medals, and these are not the medals from her two late husbands. These are all her own medals. She had medals awarded by Britain, France, Turkey, Abyssinia, and Romania, amongst other places. And she's also wearing a watch that was presented to her by the Queen, and the Nursing Journal described that watch as being studded with diamonds, rubies, and pearls. The Red Cross, of course, being in rubies. In two of her diaries, I found poems that she wrote, both about her late husband Dick and both about this concept of him waiting for her on what she called the other side. Here's a part of a poem. "The wind shall whisper softly the name I hold so dear. You perchance may call me, and I perchance may hear. Sweet are those days of future, even though I wait a while, before their consummation in the glory of your smile. For you know I am waiting, and will not be denied, when God has raised the curtain which veils the other side." Now, one of the first things I said was that there were two women in the story. So, of course, there is another woman, and the other woman truly loved Dick Doughty Wiley, and the other woman might have left that wreath on that single grave. The other woman's name was Gertrude Bell. She's not that well known in Australia, and certainly not as well known as she is in the UK. Usually at a talk I say, who's heard of Gertrude Bell? And out of 50 people, there'll be maybe 2 people who put their hands up. Can we have the next picture, please? Heidi, or the boys out the back, whoever's doing the pictures. So this is young Gertrude Bell at Oxford University, because she was one of the first women ever to go to Oxford University. This is 1886. Cambridge wasn't even thinking about letting women through the gates of the colleges back in 1886, but Oxford was doing it in a limited way. So at Oxford University, Gertrude Bell did 3 years' work in 2 years, and she was the first woman to be awarded an honours degree in modern history and archaeology. And this high achievement is how she lived her whole life. She came from a very wealthy family, and she could satisfy her curiosities, if she liked, by travelling the world, by doing anything, or even by doing nothing. But she wanted to do more than that. Her uncle was the British ambassador to Persia, which existed before the First World War, and she went and stayed with him in her 20s, and that visit changed her whole life. She fell in love with the deserts of Arabia, and she fell in love with the ancient archaeology that was in the desert. Can we have the next picture, please? I see Liz is putting up a thing about a series called ANZAC Girls that, yes, is set on the island of Lemnos. Also in Canopy, the ERL system, there is a film called Queen of the Desert, which is about Gertrude Bell, starring Nicole Kidman as Gertrude Bell. But factually, it's a dreadfully awful, horrible Hollywood version of what is actually an interesting story. If you want to learn about Gertrude Bell, I can recommend a book to you rather than go and see this crummy movie. But anyway, go and see the crummy movie if you have an urge. Gertrude Bell, here she is as a young archaeologist at an oasis somewhere. And before long, she was a very skilled archaeologist, and she did some pioneering work, especially some amazing photography. Now, photography before the First World War was a big wooden box on a tripod you got under the black cloth. You had another box at your feet. You took a packet out of that box, and you took out a slide, and you exposed the slide, and then you put it back in its little packet, and then you put it back in the box at your feet. And if you're lucky, it exposed it just right. You actually had a picture. So it was complicated and cumbersome stuff. Gertrude Bell has left behind 7,000 glass plate negatives that are now kept at the Newcastle University, Newcastle in northern England, not Newcastle in northern New South Wales. So she would traipse around the desert literally for months at a time with tents and food and supplies and assistance and equipment, and take these photographs. So this was a sign of her. Whatever she put herself to, she went full on at it. In the middle of these desert sojourns, she moved to Haifa, which is on the coast of the Mediterranean. It's in Israel today. And there she seriously studied Persian and Arabic. And within a few years, she was translating ancient Persian poetry, and it was being published in London. At a dig in Western Turkey, she met 2 men that she'd have a lot to do with for at least the next decade. Can we have the next picture? Okay. So the man, they're both wearing Oxford blazers from different colleges, and the man on the left is Leonard Woolley. He was an archaeologist from Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, which is still a big, fantastic museum and centre of archaeology today. And the young fellow with the shorts on the right, you will know who he is, but you don't really realise who he is. Can we have the next picture? The young fellow on the right is called Thomas Edward Lawrence, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia. So these 2 men were close friends of Gertrude's, and she worked and stayed with them at these desert digs out in the middle of the, in the Middle East and Arabian Peninsula deserts. So 1906, Gertrude left this dig in Turkey with guys like this, and she went to a nearby British consulate to pick up some mail. This, of course, was the British consulate where Dick and Lillian Doughty were. So I showed you a picture of Lillian in her garden party finery taken in Turkey a while ago. Can we have the next picture, please? You only saw half the picture. So there's the whole picture, because in the other half of the picture, of course, is Dick Doughty in a most unusual picture because he's not in uniform. I think in every other picture almost he is in uniform. Now that picture is one of the 7,000 glass plates that were taken by Gertrude Bell. So that picture is at from the Newcastle University, and is a sort of a genuine connection that the three of them were together on this day. Now, next picture, please. We'll grow Gertrude up a little bit. So here she is as an adult. It's a beautiful picture. One description said, her curls escaping from the pins soften the effect of her penetrating gaze, because she was a no-nonsense, high-achieving woman at a time when this was a bit of an unusual thing before the First World War. So after Dick's heroics at Adana, when he'd stopped this massacre and he'd got shot in the arm and he'd been awarded a medal by Turkey, Gertrude wrote to congratulate him, and they continued to write to each other for a few years. In 1908, he was back in England and he invited himself to stay at the Bells family home. And Gertrude wrote ahead to her mother, "Dearest mother, Captain Doughty suggests himself for 2 nights next on Wednesday. It's rather a bore, but I can't say anything but do come, for they were exceedingly kind to me, and he is a very nice man." Well, the upshot of this stay at the Bells' home was that Gertrude decided he was far more than a very nice man. He became the man of her dreams. And Dick and Gertrude continued to write to each other for the next 4 years from places all over the world, because they were forever travelling. And the tone of the letters gradually changed until they definitely weren't to be read by the wife Lillian anymore. You will soon see. Eventually, Dick and Gertrude had a chance to be together again in the spring of 1912. Dick and Lillian came back to England from his latest posting, which was Addis Ababa, and Lillian went on to stay with her family in Wales, which is what the usual thing that happened. Dick wrote to Gertrude while the coast was clear, and he wrote saying, "Tonight I'm alone again. My wife does not come here. She quarrelled with my people, all very nearly all her own fault." Gertrude hastily left the family home up in Yorkshire, and she came down to stay at her flat in London. The pretext was to shop and see her cousins, and she was going to give a lecture somewhere, but the real purpose, of course, was to be with Dick. And one imaginative description said, "The flicker and pulse of sexual attraction between them grew stronger with each meeting. The bond was growing, and she knew he felt it too." Inevitably, the wife Lillian returned to London. The brief episode came to an end with Gertrude, and soon after the Red Cross sent Dick and his wife, this time off to Constantinople. The war then started, and in the middle of November 1914, Dick wrote his most passionate and unreserved letter to Gertrude. Can we have the next picture? She must have nearly swooned when she read it, because she could read his writing, as I can. I'll read it to you. Dick wrote, "Tonight I should not want to talk. I should make love to you. Would you like it, welcome it, or would 100 hedges rise and bristle and divide? We would tear them down. What is the hedge that should divide us? You are in my arms, a light, a fire." Well, this concept about the hedges comes from Dick had this imaginary garden in his mind. He would go into that garden to get some peace and solitude, Sometimes, of course, the the garden was surrounded by trees or by hedges, or could be divided by hedges in this case. But anyway, once it came to being with Gertrude, he would tear them down. What is a hedge that should divide us? Tonight I do not want dreams and fancies, but it will never be. The first time, should I not be nearly afraid to be your lover? So much a thing of the mind is the insistent passion of the body. Women sometimes give themselves to men for the man's pleasure. I'd hate a woman to be like that with me. I'd want her to feel to the last sigh the same surge and stir that carried me away. She should miss nothing that I could give her. It's not a bad love letter from a career soldier. So I don't know what else they taught them at Sandhurst Military College, but he could write a good love letter. Anyway, soon Dick was off to the war. He was off to Egypt and then Gallipoli. And one of Gertrude's last letters to him had a virtual ultimatum of what was to happen after the war. Gertrude wrote, "Before all the world, claim me, take me, and hold me forever and ever. Can you do it? Dare you? When this thing is over, your work well done, will you risk it for me? It's that or nothing. I can't live without you." So Gertrude's cards were on the table. Gertrude now had a surprise visit from the wife Lillian. So did Lillian suspect that Gertrude and her husband were more than just pen friends? Gertrude wouldn't have acted her way through any deception. She called a spade and was a no-nonsense type. Lillian was described by people as being very Scottish and very feisty. So an interesting meeting it might have been, but it seems more was left unsaid than happened at the meeting. Gertrude wrote that same night a letter to Dick. March the 10th. Today, Lillian appeared in my office. I asked her to lunch. We talked of nothing save the hospital. This was Lillian's hospital, was just nearby in France where Gertrude was at that time. I hated it. Don't make me have that to bear, Dick. I'm so torn with regret tonight and with desires. They're worse to bear. I can't keep still or think or speak, and I've this night to face, this long night. It's torture, eternal torture, which never loses its edge. Oh, my dear, it might be ecstasy. There's a very different take on the same meeting in Lillian's diary. She went to Boulogne on the French coast where Gertrude was and spent a portion of the morning chasing some supplies for her hospital that was not that far away. And she wrote, I went to 4 shops before I got it. I then went and saw Miss Bell, with whom I lunched. So this excruciating episode for Gertrude that's got her tossing and turning in turmoil all night is lunch with a friend for Lillian. So her diaries are less personal than Gertrude's love letters, but it seems plain too that Lillian was a lot less suspicious than she might have been. Soon, of course, none of it mattered anymore to Dick or Gertrude or Lillian, because Dick was killed at Gallipoli about 6 weeks after the 2 women met in Boulogne. A telegram came to Lillian about Dick's death, and it ended with the words, "May God comfort you." Lillian said, "The shock was terrible." This is in her diary. "I suppose I shall have to pick up the pieces of a spoilt life. Too old to start again. Just a lonely widow." Lillian was distraught when she wrote those words, but the lonely old widow was 36 at the time only. And she did manage to struggle on. She lived another 46 years, but she never married again, and she never had another man in her life. Gertrude's life after the war was much shorter than Lillian's 46 years, but as was Gertrude's way, much more high profile. Can we have the next picture, please? 1919, they had the Paris Peace Conference. vast delegations of thousands of people met in Paris for 6 months to sort out the whole mess of World War I and to make sure that supposedly a world war could never happen again. So that didn't quite pan out, did it? Conference was dominated by the Big Four, the Prime Ministers of Italy, Britain, France and America. They produced the Treaty of Versailles. It was a very harsh treaty on the Germans, so that before long Germany was on its knees, and within a decade a little guy called Adolf Hitler came along, and he was seen as a saviour by the Germans. That was part of his appeal. It was the conditions set up by the Treaty of Versailles. Can we have the next picture, please? As I said, the conference was dominated by vast delegations. This, for instance, is most of the American delegation. So there were bigger delegations than this. There were thousands of delegates in Paris, and amongst them all there was one woman, and that was Gertrude Bell. So as was her way, she found she could achieve things that other women couldn't quite achieve. So Germany was dealt with harshly in Paris, but the Ottoman Empire had fallen apart in the Middle East. So this led to the Cairo Conference 2 years later, 1921. A young Winston Churchill was the man put in charge of the Cairo Conference. Can we have the next picture, please? His right-hand man and right-hand woman were T.E. Lawrence and Gertrude Bell. So at the conference, they created a brand new nation called Jordan. It's doing okay today. And they set in train events that soon created Iraq, which is doing not quite so well, perhaps. So at the Cairo conference, Lawrence and Gertrude Bell sold the idea to Churchill that this Bedouin prince called Faisal would be an ideal new king of a brand new country that would be called Iraq. Can we have the next picture, please? So nowadays, when the internationals meet at a conference, they put on the terrible shirts and they line up to have their photo taken. But here they went all the way, and they got out a string of camels and had this photograph taken in front of the Sphinx. And apparently soon after the photograph was taken, Winston fell off into the sand. Can we have the next picture, please? Here's a close-up of the three in the middle. Winston's only just hanging on, perhaps, and he's wearing his cool sunglasses. Gertrude's riding side saddle, and she's wearing her fur. And as is his way, Lawrence manages to wheedle his way and be front and centre of all that's going on, and then somehow pretends that he doesn't really want to be there. So it's captured the three of them quite well, I think. So after this, Gertrude Bell went and lived in Baghdad. Iraq was created, and this Bedouin prince, King Faisal, was crowned to be the first king of Iraq. She coached him to be the king. Gertrude Bell wrote the country's constitution. She designed the first national flag, and she started the first national museum to provide an alternative to all the excavated finds that archaeologists like Gertrude Bell and Lawrence were sending to the museums of England and Europe. Can we have the next picture, please? Here she is at a garden party, sitting down the front there under her parasol, talking to the newly crowned King Faisal in his white robes. And it's a garden party where the British get to meet the locals. So there's various other British types in their summer uniforms and their pith helmets in the background there, mingling with the locals. This is 1923. 3 years after this, 1926, Gertrude Bell is still in Baghdad. She swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills one night and was found dead in her bed the next morning. She was 58, and I believe she had cancer and she had had enough. Can we have the next picture, please? This is, I think, the last picture taken of Gertrude Bell. So it's 1926. She's got a pretty trendy flappers dress on for the Roaring Twenties. But when you look at her arms hanging out the side, they're like a pair of sticks. So I think she was wasting away and she'd about had enough of life. So, two amazing women with great stories, and I haven't revealed to you which of these ladies found their way to Gallipoli, but I'll tell you some of the things that they said. One of them got to Egypt, not far away, and she hinted in a letter to her mother that things were flexible if she wished to take what she just called any further journey. The other woman, she ended up nearby also, and she wrote, "They sent me out here in time to visit Saddlebar before the evacuation." That's where the grave was. But that letter she wrote years later, and I don't actually believe it's true. Now, Les Carline was a Melbourne author. He died 2 years ago. But for many years, and I'm sure on every library that's involved today, they've got a copy of his book simply titled Gallipoli. Les Carline wrote, November 1915, a woman stepped ashore at V Beach, which had become the main French base. She is thought to be the only woman to have landed during the Gallipoli campaign. We do not even know for certain who she was. Most likely, she was Lillian Doughty Wiley, who at this time worked for the French Hospital Service. She may have been Gertrude Bell, the English writer and explorer. Maybe one day they'll make a film about the mysterious woman who walked into a war to say goodbye to him. Only in that last reel will the veil be lifted to tell us whether Lillian or Gertrude trudged up that hill in 1915. And that's all I'm going to tell you. Thank you.